And good morning and welcome to Envision New Mexico this morning. And just to let you know you're in the right place. And this is Kevin Whirling, Systems Analyst for Envision. And we just had a few items to go over before we get started this morning. We are recording this session, so please do not include any confidential patient health information during the session, particularly during any case consultations. On screen right now, and actually it has been, the information for getting on audio with your telephone. Use *6 to mute and unmute, please, and I can mute you if we need to, and don't place us on hold if at all possible, or we will all hear your hold music. Please enable your camera, and as you can see, Corinne has been brave enough to get on camera today. So follow in her footsteps. There we go. Click on the little icon for the camera and then start my webcam once you're done. Oh. And thank you, Louise.
Yay, Louise.
So you'll have an opportunity to preview your image first and then click start my webcam. Our disclosure and accreditation statements. If we have anything to disclose, we would at this time. And here's information on how to be reimbursed by Molina Healthcare and Blue Cross Blue Shield Centennial Care for those patients. If you bring your patient consultations to these sessions for AHI or our pediatric nutrition telehealth or open mic, you can be reimbursed up to $150 from Molina or $80 from Blue Cross. So take advantage of that opportunity. And at this point is a good time for roll call. So if you haven't already chatted in or stated your name over audio, please do so at this point and let us know where you're from.
While people are chatting in, we'll go ahead and go around the room and introduce ourselves. So I'm Caitlin Adams. I'm a Quality Improvement Specialist here at Envision New Mexico, and I'm the facilitator for the Adolescent Health Initiative.
And I am Carletta Bullock. I'm a family medicine physician. I work at a couple of school-based health clinics here in Albuquerque and the presenter for today.
Kirsten Bennett, dietitian at Envision New Mexico.
I'm Erin Rayburn. I'm a PA at the UNM Atrisco Heritage Clinic.
I'm Melanie Baca. I'm a family doctor and an adolescent fellow, and I work at the Atrisco Clinic in the Juvenile Detention Center.
I'm Rachel Chandler. I'm a PA at the Atrisco Heritage Clinic.
McCain Scharf, Program Manager for the QI program with School-Based Health Centers here at Envision New Mexico.
Julie Brockmeyer, I'm a nurse practitioner at the Urgent Care at UNMH.
Adrienne Balboa, I'm Field Director for Strong Families New Mexico.
I'm Brandon Bell. I'm a Quality Improvement Specialist here at Envision.
And Carol Pierce, Manager for UNM Pediatrics Adolescent Medicine School-Based Health Program.
With that, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today. In continuing with our Adolescent Health Initiative series, today we will be talking about cultural perspective considerations in adolescent reproductive health. And our presenters today are Dr. Carletta Bullock, Dr. Corinne Sanchez, who is joining us remotely, and you can see her on your screen, and Adrienne Barboa, who's here in the room as well. So I will turn it over to them to go ahead and get started.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm not going to identify the school-based clinics that I work in because if there's time, we will have a case presentation, and I want to be super careful to make any distance between anything that might potentially identify. So we have a lot to cover today. I'm going to go through it somewhat quickly and rely that we are all very committed lifelong learners, and we'll be able to use these references to go into more depth than we can possibly do today. I'm going to ask that we hold all questions till the end in the interest of time as well. I'm going to present an overview, and then we will have Dr. Sanchez and Adrienne Barboa present their work that they do relevant to this information, and they definitely have way more expertise on reproductive justice than I do. This first slide is what I consider my overview slide for today's presentation. And I view that teens often put on what I call a curd suit to enter our healthcare world because their experience with it doesn't always match what we consider the gold standards for youth-friendly services. And one of the benefits of this webinar is really discussing what those gold standards are. That certainly was one of the first webinars in the series. It's been reinforced throughout the other webinars. And I think it was especially highlighted well last week with the motivational interviewing presentation. So we are reminded that from motivational interviewing to bring our curiosity about their lived experiences and values and not our assumptions. For us to all show up and honor the vulnerability and the power imbalances that are just naturally a part of coming into our settings. We're experts, we know about it, and others don't necessarily. I know for myself, because I didn't want to lose an essentialness with human encounters, and sometimes in the day-to-day world we can get so busy that I was training myself around mindfulness. And back in the days when we still had paper records exclusively, one of my practices was to put my hand on that paper record before I even opened the door and went into the room, because I wanted to remind myself that I was getting to go sit down with a precious human being, and that sometimes I could get lost in all the other tasks and goals that I had in mind, and I didn't want to miss that exchange of one precious human being with another. I think it's especially true when we talk about teams as well. The idea is that we're mutually impacted, right? So whoever is sitting with us has a story to tell, and we have information, but it's a two-way exchange, not a one-way. I'm not just a talking head expert who says, you should, blah, 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 blah. And those of us in this room are well champions of that, fortunately. And I always wanted to be able to say that when I'm sitting in a setting, there are spheres of relations and belonging that are important. So maybe in front of me is a team, but that team belongs to his or herself. That team belongs to that school to some degree, to the peers, to the family, to the community, and all those spheres are important in any exchange that we have as well. So what I wanted to be able to say is sometimes our narratives don't match, and to give better service, what I wanted to offer today were at least 3 tools to consider around looking at these power inequities, and also looking around mutual influence between both the youth and the care provider to honor the youth as indivisible from all those other spheres of belonging. So I'm going to begin by telling 2 stories as a backdrop for my presentation today. The first one is from Dr. Antonia Darder, and she's a professor of education at Loyola University in Los Angeles. And this story comes earlier in her career when she was a Head Start teacher in a community in LA that was primarily Latino and Chicano. And she talked about the glory she had when she was teaching these tiny young people to learn, to be excited about their learning. And they were moving from Head Start to kindergarten. And they were getting assessments for their kindergarten placement. And one of the questions that was asked on their assessment, there was a piece of paper, and it had 4 individuals on the piece of paper. One was a fireman, one was a policeman, one was a doctor, and one was a bus driver. And they had all the accoutrements so they could identify. And the question was, what do these 4 have in common? And overwhelmingly, the students gave the answer of, they all help us. Because what they drew from was their family value experience of relationships. And these 4 characters on that piece of paper represented individuals who help us. The standardized answer for that question was, they are all men. Because the lesson was a lesson in categorizing and taxonomy. So instead of a both and acceptance of, wow, look how wonderful your answer is, it is so true, they help us, they were told that their answer was wrong because it didn't match the dominant narrative answer for this question. And Dr. Darder talks about the impact that has for all future learning early on in the experience and how important it is. The second story I want to tell is also from Los Angeles, from East Los Angeles, and this was actually a YouTube capture. It's not my story in any way. But it was a story about, look at this phenomenon in which young parents, and these parents had a median age of 20, so they ranged younger and some older, who were investing quite a bit of money to have parties for when their kindergartners graduated from kindergarten. And they had processions, and they had caps and gowns, and they played pomp and circumstance, and they got diplomas. And they said, why would anybody spend so much money on a kindergarten? It's not even a graduation. We call it just a matriculation. They go to this first grade. So when they were interviewed, these young parents said, I may never see this child graduate from the 12th grade. I want to have the experience of cap We value education. It's so important to us. But because of what I see happening in my community, my child may not live long enough to graduate. Too many other circumstances might happen that my child may not be able to graduate, and I want to be able to do that. So those are the two stories I want us to hold as a backdrop to the presentation today. The second one gives the power for lived experience that shapes behavior. So this is a depiction of what I wanted to show about the complexity and the indivisibility of ideas as we talk about them. So we've already talked about the developmental age tasks that adolescents have and how huge that is. Tasks about relationships and peers and whether or not to have sex and relationships with families, cognitive development, a huge range. That's just one spectrum by itself. Social identity development spectrum is also huge. Not only that, but our current research shows how much it harms when denigrating or shaming narratives interfere with healthy development of those social identities. So of that entire spectrum, here's just one, and that one is this, not even a complete, but a partial spectrum of sexuality and a whole range. And among other things, we don't always even give the opportunity for those definings, right? So one of the adolescent forms that I use pretty much every day, there is a spectrum of sexuality, and it's phrased as, how do you identify? And the choices are heterosexual, straight, comma, gay or lesbian, comma, bisexual, or not sure. In this whole spectrum, there are just 4 choices, and we talk about normalizing. What if my choice is not there? What am I going to do? Most often I see adolescents simply skip that whole question and go to the next one. But it's the importance of these are multiple spectrums, and they are complex, and they are indivisible from that precious human being. So one of the first tools I'm offering today is the idea of cultural humility. Cultural competence was the model that was first emerged, and here's the definition of cultural competence. After various limitations with that model were reviewed, it has been revisited, and ultimately the development of cultural humility model was developed. So this is the definition of cultural humility. A commitment of active engagement in a lifelong process that individuals enter into an ongoing process with patients, communities, colleagues, and with themselves. A process that requires humility and how we bring into check the power imbalances that exist in the dynamics of communication. So this slide is a comparison of cultural competence and cultural humility. The goals of cultural competence, and I think it's important to understand the context. Cultural competence came out of a bit of a legalistic context. One of the things that happened were sometimes there were misdiagnoses, there were these ideas of non-compliance, and then it became a question of, well, what are we missing culturally that's contributing to that? So one of the goals from a cultural competence model is to be able to reduce those negative outcomes in the medical health setting. Whereas for cultural humility, to encourage personal reflection and growth around culture in order to increase awareness of service providers, the values, knowledge, and training, and for cultural humility, introspection and co-learning. That reciprocity issue is very important. The shortcomings, so for cultural competence, it enforces the idea that there can be competence in a culture other than one's own, supports the myth that cultures are monolithic. It's based on academic knowledge rather than lived experience. It believes professionals can be certified in culture. For cultural humility, it's challenging for professionals to grasp the idea of learning with and from clients. There is no end result, which those in academia and in medical fields can sometimes struggle with. The strengths, cultural competence allows for people to strive to obtain a goal, and it promotes skill building. For cultural humility, it encourages lifelong learning with no end goal, but rather an appreciation of the journey of growth and understanding. It puts professionals and clients in a mutually beneficial relationship, and it attempts to diminish damaging power dynamics. So right away, you can see cultural humility is much more in line with motivational interviewing. Right? It is also process-oriented to understand values as opposed to imposing an agenda. So this slide is for our further edification when we have time. I want to point out the second one is a PowerPoint presentation that was put together by the Alameda County Public Health Department. And it's a PowerPoint. It's really quite excellent because it gives the historical context for the development of cultural competence, including the fact that it was adopted by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services under the CLASS directive. So it has connotations today that are both financial and legal, because without those CLASS requirements in federal funding, one can be defunded or not funded. So it has legal ramifications as well. The second one is a YouTube video by the founders of the Culture of Humility model. These are both physicians in the Bay Area today, so Dr. Melanie Turlon and Dr. Jan Murray Garcia. The table that I used earlier came from Wikipedia for simplicity's sake. So now I'm going to go over the idea of tools for reproductive justice. This is the classic definition of reproductive justice by the Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice. Is one of the original definitions. Reproductive justice is defined as the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, social, and economic well-being of women and girls, based on the full achievement and protection of women's rights. These are key reproductive justice principles. We believe that every woman has the right to decide if and when she will have a baby and the conditions under which she will give birth. Decide if she will not have a baby and her options for preventing or ending pregnancy. Third, parent the children she has with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the government. This is from Sister Song. It's a collection of women of color organizations around reproductive health issues. For the most part, we who are in this field of reproductive health as providers and health caregivers, we completely align with the first 2 points, but often think that the third is outside of our particular purview. But we'll notice that the third is very much tied with the second story I gave about the conditions and the lived experience. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because I was looking for ways to simplify very complex concepts. And this one I found on a blog site by Reproductive Health Reality Check. And this particular writer uses this practice just to show something about the complexity. So the question is, what things in this person's life will impact their ability to create the family they want to create? So where that person lives, what religion, what sexuality that person identifies, how much money has that person, all these impact in very profound and significant ways. So this one's so important, I want to stay on it a little bit because these reflect social constructs, and they're not neutral social constructs. We live in a society where these constructs are given values. Some are given lesser than values, and they have impact because of that. So for the most part, the lesser than are assigned by dominant narratives. So in addition to all these complex issues being forces that impact a family and a community, visualize a wall of disempowerment around this whole, if this were a community, visualize a wall of disempowerment around all the groups so labeled as lesser. So getting out lacks ease. Social mobility, although it's extolled as the American dream, it is actually politically variable, and the ease in which we hope that it would exist does not. The net effect is systematic social exclusion. Systematic because it's not accidental, and it is not upon the individual. It is the whole groups so defined. It also depicts what reproductive justice considers the fundamental problem, which is lack of power to have the necessary social supports embedded in the third item that we talked about as the reproductive key principles. instead of getting the support they need to have the families grow up in these safe, violence-free environments that are healthy, they in fact get stressors and pressures because of these social values that are placed. So individual escape does not change the system, and ironically, individual escape can in fact be more harmful, and we'll talk about that more later. So the other reason I put this slide up in this way is I wanted to focus a little bit on the idea of intersectionality. And as I understand it, there's at least a couple of understandings, there's probably more, but one is each and every one of these is impactful, and as we will discover later, the impact is on the physical health and well-being of the individual. But secondly, having one of these pressures is far less than being an individual who is suffering under several of these pressures. So if one had, for instance, the gender pressure, in our society, male gender is conferred higher value than female gender. That's one set of pressures. But if one also had issues of gender, ability, and sexuality, that's far more confounding. The intersectionality of those three is also very important and far more powerful in terms of that pressure that that individual is under. So this is a comparison between reproductive health and reproductive justice. And this actually comes from... Great. So here are the references, and I highly recommend that you use the Strong Families website. They have a resource tab, which is quite excellent and comprehensive. The first one is a PowerPoint presentation. I understand it's been approved by Sister Song, and it is an excellent overview of reproductive justice in way more detail than I'm able to accomplish here as well. So, impact lessons learned from the reproductive justice lens. Remembering and unsilencing the little herd compelling overriding narratives, such as historic memory of forced sterilizations disproportionately of women of color, Native American, African American, Puerto Rican, and Mexican American into the 70s, and other incidents collectively known as reproductive oppression occurred and is still impacting trust. And some would say, well, you know, that was a long time ago. I would say that the collective memory is just as powerful today, but in some ways, it's not so long ago. So when we look at the predecessor to the current implant, the long-acting reversible contraceptive method known as Nexplanon, it had a precursor called Norplant. Norplant was approved to use in the United States in 1990, but the first Western nation that approved its use was Finland in 1983. However, all the clinical trials were done in Chile in 1974. Some would wonder why an impoverished nation of women of color was chosen as the site for those initial clinical trials so that Western nations could finally sign off and approve it. In addition to that, you know, the idea that the laws are really codified beliefs and practices and reflect whatever the beliefs are at the time. In 1990, when the FDA approved Norplant, legislators in the United States, and within 2 years of the introduction of the Norplant, there were 24 bits of legislation that incentivized women who were on welfare to get the Norplant. And sometimes they weren't incentives, they were time benefits to receiving the Norplant. Fortunately, there were enough outrage and uproar that none of that legislation was passed. However, if we look at these models and the strategies, they're sometimes well-intentioned, well-meaning, but not comprehensive enough. So at that time, Medicaid approved payment for the implant, the Norplant insertion, but somehow left out approving payment for the removal. And that had to be rectified. So it's not over in the minds of many people who have to receive health care from us. So it does require putting on a courage suit to go into the average clinic to get health care, even today. So the lesson learned are those also looking at the system change that need to happen. Many of our programs are individually focused and inadvertently, I like to think, wind up blaming as opposed to helping, and expert opinions are challenged. So because we tend to remember information better when it's packaged in a story, what I'd like to give is a story of one researcher that elucidates these lessons well. I want to say, before I give one story, is there's so many researchers, and I am grateful giving this presentation today because the body of evidence-based knowledge is so extensive today, and I'm going to give references for that. But for ease sake and facility sake, I'm going to use it through one researcher, and I actually get to give credit to my colleague, Adrienne, who pointed out this body of research because it wasn't on the tip of my tongue either. Okay, so this is the story of Dr. Arlene Geronimus, and she was an undergraduate at Princeton in 1976. She was a health education major. She was also a research assistant in the Department of Education, where the expert opinions about what should be impacting for the high teen pregnancy rate for Black teenagers in Trenton, New Jersey, that's where Princeton is located, was being developed. And her professor said, well, the biggest problem is they lack information for preventing pregnancies. Armed with this information, she went to the local family planning and she worked with a very specific population. This is a population of teen moms. They were pregnant at the time and they were in this program because they were going to become teen moms. So she sat down and she says, well, I'm here to arm you with information so that you will not have unintended pregnancies. And they smiled and they said, you know what? We know how to prevent pregnancies. And she said, well, why are you pregnant? And they told her stories of how they worked sometimes 2 years to become pregnant. They were delighted by their pregnant. They wanted to be pregnant. It was important to them. They had family support systems in place. And she sat in this two-way exchange. She listened to those lived experiences and she asked, what's happening with these non-matching narratives, right? I have my professors who say they shouldn't be pregnant and they are pregnant because they lack information. And yet, these teenagers are telling me that's not the case at all. So she used her open mind and her cultural humility stance and she sought an explanatory model. So in the 80s, she went from being an undergraduate at Princeton, she went to Harvard School of Public Health because she wanted to learn to be able to do empiric research that would stand the rigors of any critique. And she did. And once she was well armed, she began to conduct these studies. So one of the things that happened in her era is studies were done that compared teen pregnancy outcomes with non-teen pregnancy outcomes. And so she looked at age of the teen pregnancy. And what she discovered is that the deleterious outcomes that were the average standard opinion at the time were not supported by her research findings. She did not find that the teenagers had more complications in their pregnancy. She did not find that their parenting skills were deficient. She looked at parameters of intelligence, of social interaction, of oppositional. She looked at so many parameters, and they were average for average Americans. They were not matched. Not only did she find that, what was confounding for her is that there was lower infant mortality rates for Black teens than Black mothers in their 20s. Big confounder. Her question was, why was that so? And if that was the lived experience of this population, and you looking at a survival model, isn't it actually wise to have babies earlier than later because you're going to have a worse outcome later? So in her quest to have an explanatory model for that, she developed something called the weathering model. So the weathering model captures her observation that Black adolescents she was studying seemed prematurely and disproportionately worn out, whether they had teen pregnancies or not. And infant mortality rates is mostly connected to the health of the mother. So moving forward, Her original studies were mostly social and behavioral studies, and they were considered soft science. Eventually, she had to collaborate with hard scientists to conduct biochemical and cellular biology studies. She did so. And again, weathering is defined as an accelerated biological aging in response to repeated or prolonged adaptation to subjective and objective stressors. And in our minds, go back to slide 16, where we saw all those stressors in a community. So in her extended research, first she started looking at biological stressors. Those are the various stress hormones, of which there are many, and she called it an allostatic load. So the more stress you had, the higher was your load of these stress chemicals, and the longer they were operating in your body, and the more toll they took on your physiology. Those were considered, again, qualitative study, and she was challenged to have something that was a quantitative study. So then she allied with cellular biologists who were looking at telomeres. Telomeres are the caps on the DNA strand that protects your cells from premature aging. So if you have shorter telomeres, your cells are older than if you have longer telomeres. So they're a marker of cellular age. So in May 2015, the telomere study findings were published, and the findings are that urban poor in the United States are experiencing accelerated aging at the cellular level, and chronic stress linked both to income level and racial ethnic identity is driving this physiologic deterioration. So what she said about this study, it is that it is the most rigorous research of its kind, examining how structurally rooted social processes work through biologic mechanisms to impact health. The researchers analyzed the telomeres of poor and lower middle class Black, white, and Mexican residents of Detroit. One of the co-authors of her study, Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, helped to discover telomeres, an achievement that won her the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2009. So whereas Dr. Geronimus started out as a social scientist and increasingly had to ally with laboratory scientists, Dr. Blackburn was the other way. She started out as a laboratory scientist. She discovered telomeres in single cell organisms that she was looking at in pond scum. However, what she said about this last study that she collaborated on with Dr. Geronimus is so much of what makes people either well-being or not is not coming from within themselves. It's coming from their circumstances. It makes me think much more about social justice and the bigger issues that go beyond individuals. In this next slide, I wanted to show some of the elements from her study that she highlights as exceedingly important about this particular study. She was here in our very own Albuquerque in May 2015 at UNM as part of the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Series. And these comments come from that presentation. That presentation, we are so fortunate, is on YouTube. So we can all look at it directly, I must say. So weathering, once again, that definition, socially structured repeated stress process activation, which can accumulate and increase health vulnerability across the life course in marginalized groups. What Dr. Geronimus says is she studied it from teenagers and beyond, but there are increasing numbers of studies that show this impact begins in utero. That's how important it is. Weathering consequences, pernicious and early onset of stress-related diseases. One of the most classically studied stress-related diseases is hypertension, but there's a whole range of them. Increased allostatic loads, again, that's the stress-mediated wear and tear, work disabilities, functional limitation, personal care disability, accelerated aging, and excess death. So the elements that she says are so important for us to extract from her studies is because weathering leads to adaptations in social and even family structure. The broader society does not understand or see these differences as responsive, sensible, or adaptive. They tend to see them as more signs that the marginalized group is pathologic and are deficient in some way. Also, that the policies then created from this view of pathology often then actually disrupts autonomous protections. That's the word she used for the coping mechanisms of living in these overwhelming, stressful environments. And those actually create new stressors. Also, the net health impact is both how the weathering environment affects health and how the group health affects the strategies to survive and do its best to thrive in an environment that is rigged against the group. The healthier the group is, the better they're able to mitigate. The response can either be what she calls shelter or storm. On balance, they are shelter, and that's why groups do them and continue to do them. This idea of shelter and storm is not every coping mechanism is a healthy coping mechanism. Sometimes mechanisms are escape mechanisms. We see drug addiction. We see many things. However, her studies and her conclusion is that for the most part, these coping mechanisms tend to be more mitigating, i.e. sheltering from the impact of the stressors, than they are storm. And this is the other thing that I think is so key, and it's definitely an eye-opener for me, is that some of those stresses are way too high. She calls it high effort coping, and it's not only as stressful to the individual, it doesn't mean that our public and social policy should be absolved of needing to change the rigged structures out of a belief that groups can just adapt. They can have these interesting and rich cultural ways to adapt. One of the studies shows that if you look at, on one parameter, well-being and health, and on another coordinate, the idea of higher, increasing socioeconomic status, including income, for Black women in America, there is the predictable increase in the curve up to a certain social income and socioeconomic status, and then the curve actually declines. That's her idea of a high effort stress to maintain it in an environment of discrimination and oppressions. One of the ways that I think of it is think about being an individual in this wall of social isolation and exclusion and having yourself chained to the wall, but being like a motor revving up trying to get out of there. What kind of stress is that going to take on? So those are important messages. So examples of what she calls autonomous protective systems are kin networks in a community. So these are family supporting economies and caretaking systems. So one of the consequences of this weathering phenomenon in communities is that the communities have to live with higher tolls of illness and disability and aging prematurely. So families have to support all these individuals who are so impacted. So sometimes the kin networks allow for one person to have 2, 3 jobs to bring income to the family, allows for somebody who's maybe too ill to be able to do that, to take care of the young ones and the elders. And those kin networks are important for mitigating some of the impact of all these stressors. The second is called collective ethos over the individualistic, that working together to support each other in those oppressive communities is much more than one individual trying to survive it alone. The third one is collective density. And this, for me, is the idea of a soft place to land. What many of these studies show is that the social milieu is constantly bombarded with attacks on one's personhood and one's sense of social safety. And one needs a soft place to land. So these are those environments when, after working however long in those environments, you can come back to the shared experience and relax and not expect to be bombarded. And sometimes have that shared experience, and many times humor to have catharsis from the impact of those. And the final one on this list is an alternative cultural framework to the framework that's marginalizing, an affirmative value system. And we often hear so many of those. I'm sure that we can pull up several as we thought about it. So other key concepts here is that individual resilience, which a lot of the individual strategies that are used in the reproductive health model can actually be equivalent to high effort coping, and it increases weathering, does not decrease, but increases. Stereotype and social identity threat, there are multiple assaults triggering the stress physiologic response. It is sometimes known as death by a million cuts. The cues are ubiquitous in our society, and surprisingly, the recipient doesn't have to be the direct target. That person can simply be in an environment where others are targeted. They don't have to be conscious. They can also be subconscious. And it has the same physiologic response. So the conclusion, being marginalized plays with your sense of validation and affirmation and how to feel good about your cultural values. And it is the undermining of this sense that is so damaging to health. That was Dr. Geronimus's conclusion. And we can see how that matches with the first story I told you about the young children who had this beautiful right answer, and yet the dominant narrative says, no, you're wrong, and that's wrong. So her conclusion is that good health stems from a sense of rootedness in an affirmation of cultural values, practices, effective ties, and beliefs that give life meaning, and not just from material resources. Again, I'm going to allow us to tap in on our lifelong learning skills, and I offer these as references. The lecture series that she was part of here at UNM is that YouTube reference there. Also, the definitive source today, if you can only go to one, is Unnatural Causes. Every body of research of so many famous, wonderful researchers is listed under the Unnatural Causes recite. One of them is Dr. Kumara Jones, who has been active with the CDC and has so many allegories to help explain this impact. But Dr. Geronimus' work, along with a body of many others, is that it's not benign. It's not just a social problem. It has physiologic manifestations. So finally, and this I'm going to go fast because it's taken a little longer than I would hope to. The other tool that I have to offer is if we find ourselves in non-matched narratives and we can't make headway on it, then we can certainly support those programs that do have subscribed programs, well-defined programs that are helpful. This came from Advocates for Youth. They advocate for youth around issues of reproductive health, and this came from one of their studies on what are effective for youth of color. Promote gender-specific interventions. So here's this information here, but one of the things that I like to recall when I think of one of my colleagues, Carlos Romero, who's director of the South Valley Male Involvement Project, he really talks about the importance of true engagement, not just participation in some program, not in participation in some program that says this is information you need to know. But going back to slide 16 again, where is it that we're having impact and change on the structural systems that cause these confinements, that cause these separations from involvement? We don't need to go far back in our own history to look at the various welfare reforms, one of which said that if you're in this milieu, the intersectionality of all these forces, and you need a little more income, we will give that to you, but you need to separate the men from the family in order for that to happen. We don't discount those today, and if we're looking at gender specific, then we need to be comprehensive and holistic in our view about that as well. Support interventions that seek to address or influence social, political, and or economic environments to address disparities in reproductive health issues. That's all of what we talked about with the reproductive justice lens. And again, promoting reproductive justice. This is also from Asian communities of reproductive justice, and I always like to say, look at the comparison of this to Dr. Geronimus's conclusion from her years in her body of work as well. Reproductive justice will exist when all people have the social, political, and economic power and resources to make healthy decisions about our gender, body, sexuality, for ourselves, our family, and our communities. Reproductive justice aims to transform power inequities and create long-term systemic change, and therefore relies on the leadership of communities most impacted by reproductive oppression. The reproductive justice framework recognizes that all individuals are part of communities, and that our strategies must uplift entire communities to support individuals. So, in conclusion, I would like to say when narratives don't match, to consider using these three tools presented today and begin to practice a both and stance and move away from the traps of the either or. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Corinne Sanchez. Here are the references for some of the local effective programs right here in our area. They're on the page so we can all study later. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Corinne Sanchez.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Okay, I'm cold. My office is freezing. I just want to highlight a couple of the pieces that were discussed earlier. I think we're right on all of these topics. I think this is something that our work as Pale Women United has been focusing on as we developed our programming for the past 26 years, really looking at racism, classism, sexism, this matrix of domination that Patricia Hill Collins talks about. And so I just want to say again, my name is Corinne Sanchez. I am Executive Director of Tewa Women United, which is an indigenous women's organization located in northern New Mexico. And do I have the ability to forward the slides?
No, let me know and I'll forward it for you.
All right, thank you. So Tewa Women United really believes in ending violence, building beloved communities to end violence against women, girls, and Mother Earth. Really conscious of the intersectionality that was discussed earlier. And our whole purpose is about this uprooting the culture of violence and replanting a culture of peace. So all of the traumas and oppressions that were discussed earlier, how have those impacted indigenous communities? And again, really highlighting that piece of we as individual women in our communities did not get to this place by ourselves, where we have high diabetes rates, where we have high suicide rates, where we have high alcoholism rates. All of that was strategic policies that were put into place that disrupted cultural and traditional ways of being. And so our role in Tewa Women United is how do we reclaim our ancestral knowledge? How do we acknowledge that we have been lifelong scientists? I think the last section of the presentation earlier highlights how much soft science versus hard science and how that impacts our lives. And so really looking at social scientists and the behaviors in our community, but also really looking at how those directly impact our health as Indigenous women, our access to health care, our access to reproductive health, all of those different pieces. And so the next slide. So this just talks about our definition of beloved communities and families. So there are spaces where all our children can grow into loving, caring, nurturing, powerful beings, who they were meant to be from the beginning of our thoughts and our prayers. We're communities where everyone is valued and has a role, and where the love of Mother Earth and all beings seen and unseen is the energy that drives our actions. So how do we counter the darkness and the violence in our communities is around the self-love and energy around caring for ourselves and then expanding that out into our communities. And part of our organization is the belief in social change and social transformation. So Kathy Sanchez, who's my mother and an elder within our organization now, has been part of Beloved Communities, Council of Elders through the Beloved Communities, which was Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. The elders and the youth that were in that movement are now elders in our communities, and really trying to carry forward the values that came from that struggle of human rights, of civil rights, of valuing our community-based knowledge and information. So next slide. So in Tewa Women United, our programming comes from the belief that our culture is our strength. So any program that we're developing, any project that we're looking at coming from that core value of the responsibility of each of us to protect the most vulnerable in our community. And so if we're looking at really protecting the most vulnerable in the community, that in turn comes to really being able to ensure that all of us are protected. If we're protecting our disabled, our pregnant women, our children, we're ensuring that our future is passed on in those different ways. We're also in that act, again, ensuring that all of us have access to everything that we need, that we're cared for, that we're protected, that we're secure. Next slide. So based on the discussion that was led earlier, we're looking at theoretical frames. So Teoman United has our theory of OPEDI, which is braiding. Dr. Patricia Hill Collins talks about a matrix of domination, and in this piece, the OPEDI is our cultural reflection of that, which is braiding and weaving together, which also results in a pattern, right? A counter pattern to these oppressions, to this intersectionality. But we're really bringing together our ancestral knowledge, indigenous knowledge, with Western theoretical knowledge frames as well. So our grounding as Teoman United was based in feminist thought. We are a women's organization, so we're coming from that perspective of women, empowering women from that core, that center. Critical race theory, really looking at how populations throughout this country have been pushed aside, pushed to the margins, have experienced genocide and historical traumas. We were fortunate as an organization to really work with some scholars from our communities who are doing amazing work, and that opportunity allowed us to work with Dr. Eduardo Duran and Bonnie Duran in the foundations of the development of our sexual violence program. And they really highlighted they were really talking about post-colonial psychology. And so we've incorporated a lot of that in our work around trauma and recovery from trauma of sexual assault and other experiences that we've had as Indigenous people. We also were able to work with Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart around historical trauma, her historical unresolved grief, and the foundations of really why it's important for us to understand the history that occurred in this country, the history that occurred in northern New Mexico. We have waves of colonization that came in. So we have the Spanish influence, the Mexican influence, and the U.S. Governmental influence. And so with each of those waves came different types of repercussion, different types of issues that we had to look at, and also different types of policies that were put into place in our communities. And so really teaching our young people to understand this history so they understand, again, we as Indigenous people, we as families and communities aren't at this place by ourselves. We're strategic policies that were meant to kill us, meant to erase us. So the forced sterilization that happened through IHS, the most recent say in 1971 is kind of like when that practice stopped. But what we know is that this continues to be a practice in our systems, such as crack, which is sterilizing low-income women, African-American women in their communities who are using drugs or drug users, sterilization of prison populations, and what we see in Tuskegee and right now most recently in Guatemala, and what was mentioned earlier was the testing of contraceptives and other STD preventative measures on indigenous populations. So right now I know in Guatemala it was just brought forward about how the people there were tested upon. And so this piece of really trying to look at why people have such a, it's kind of like this double piece where we have a reverence for medical providers, where we have this, placing our health into other people's hands, that they're the experts and we're not, to this place of really valuing our expertise and coming from our experiences, and this distrust of a system that has abused and violated our populations and our communities. So again, we're looking at how do we blend these different experiences, how do we do this opeti, which is the braiding of these theories and also the braiding of our ancestral knowledge. So next slide. So just completing my doctorate, I was able to have the opportunity to reflect and look upon the 26 years that we've come to be where we're at as Taylor Women United, and really looking at, my apprehension about research and researching, and really coming to the place where Dr. Linda Smith came from, in recognizing that we have always continuously done research. We have always continuously had a methodology in which we as Indigenous people brought forward knowledge into our community. As a potter, I can say, my great-great-grandmother revived a technique, and in reviving that technique, there was centuries that happened to get us to that place of our pottery, our art. How do we know to mix river silt with volcanic ash, to put that as a temper so that it would withstand the firing? How do we know which river bed materials, clays, would allow for the sheen to happen on our pots? When you rub that clay with a stone and you're aligning the crystals to get the shine, to the different pigmentations of our plant colorings. And so I think this is a piece where in our communities with our young people to really stress to them, again, the importance of learning and knowing our history, of learning and knowing science and how that has continued to exist before, that existed before Western knowledge in our particular area, and in other cultures and communities. So our research methodology is really about coming from a place of Sigimabe, which is our loving, caring, and looking out for one another and those yet to come, and our Mother Earth. So we recognize that we cannot exist in this world without our mother. She is the first giver of life through the water, through the air, through the land. We know scientifically that we cannot survive without air or water. And so these are pieces of that knowledge. And so bringing this forward, that our programming is building upon the strengths that our culture is our strength. So integrating that into our programming, again, protecting those most vulnerable. Any programming or project that we develop should be strengthening personal and collective sovereignty of us as individuals and us as the communal processes or collective of our tribal nations. That we're looking at the importance of the creation of healthy relationships, infant-child mental health, attachment and bonding, all the way through to our physical beings and our mental health, that those are important to how well we are in our communities, our wholeness, that we have this connectedness to Mother Earth and her gifts, that we've had abilities to release trauma, heal illnesses through that collective memory of the plants that were given by our mother, the waters, the sacred waters at Ojo Caliente, and how those also relieve stress and open us to being able to absorb other positive things, and that our research methodology really honors the feminine strength. Because of the ways of colonization in our communities, we really have looked at bringing forward that feminine strength, and I think the Western model has followed suit in those different pieces around how we have specific health issues as women and how we face those. I want to share a couple of two different projects that we have going on that address that. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about, and I know this is what Dr. Bullock wanted us to highlight, was our Being Healthy Sexuality Body Sovereignty project. And this project came with the vision, the overall vision of Taylor Women United. So in our first formative years, we really focused on environmental justice because we understand that our health is connected to the health of our environment. We are one of a few indigenous nations that actually shares a border with a nuclear defense research facility. which is now threatened by a plume of chromium that is coming into our lands, and a plume of perchlorates. And we know that these are chemicals and contaminants that pass through the placental barrier. And so it's really important for us to understand, as we're promoting breastfeeding, as we're promoting organic gardening, that there are things that are beyond our control. And yes, we have this long legacy of farming, but we also have this history of the U.S. government coming in, condemning our most sacred land to build a nuclear defense research facility, contaminations of man-made and natural hazardous chemicals to us. And so for us to be able to understand that science and also understand the science of our health, and what does that mean as we women who have more fatty tissue, where those contaminants are stored in our breast milk and then are passed on to our children. There's Milk Project, Bosnia was one that we really looked at, talking to the indigenous midwives to get that knowledge. So environmental justice is a foundational piece. Then we looked at the experience of the women in our circle, and we know from research that Native women, 1 in 3 Native women is going to experience sexual assault in her lifetime. In our early formation, the reality was that 100% of the women that were in our circles experienced sexual assault. So our Voices program was key for us in really addressing a lot of the traumas that we were seeing in our family. But when you take that history and you look at it, what does this mean if 1 in 3 women or 100% of women in our circle were experiencing sexual assault? How does that experience then play out in your birthing experience, in your breastfeeding experience? What is that connection to body and body health and imagery, and our youth around their sexuality and their sexual health? And so really looking at how these violences and how these traumas not only affect the individual but are passed down through generations, because we know these were strategies and tactics of the U.S. governmental systems to rape and assault and commit genocide and gynocide in indigenous communities. So this historical piece, this intergenerational then passing on of violence and trauma to our individual experiences of sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and other related traumas in our communities. And so our Voices program was another aspect of what we developed in this holistic approach to our community wellness and healing. And then from that 15 years of really doing sexual assault intervention and looking at child sexual abuse, I'm a trained forensic interviewer, so I'm really excited about you all doing motivational interviewing as part of collection of health information from individuals. So I interviewed children for the past 15 years about their experience around child sexual abuse, helped develop multidisciplinary teams, helped develop a systemic approach for communities to address sexual abuse. We've influenced federal policy around that for child sexual abuse investigations and interventions. But we kept seeing little and little change in the criminal justice system. Less than 2% of these cases are ever going to be prosecuted. So what does that mean to the healing of family and community from this type of trauma? And so from that, we gathered our women, and throughout our process, always about gathering our community, about talking, about figuring out, brainstorming what are the issues facing our community, what are some of the solutions that we have. And so from there, we developed our Yia Bikegendi Doula program, because we were asking the question, how did we get to this place of 1 in 4 children, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys experiencing child sexual abuse before the age of 18? And that's a national statistic. That's not just a tribal statistic. And for us, it was what influenced and impacted our ability to parent, what impacted our ability to look at birth and where that happened and how that happened. And so we know with IHS coming into our communities that home birthing and midwives, that culturally based knowledge kind of moved out into a medical model. And so part of our reproductive justice is about reintroducing midwifery into our communities, home birthing, and other options. You know, I'm grateful to all of you who are in the room who are doing this work. But there's also a place of medical, economic base, right? So we know that home birthing costs almost 1/10 of what a medical birth costs, and I'm not, don't quote me on that here. What I know is medical birthing is around $16,000. Home birthing with a midwife is around $2,000. And so what does that mean for access? What does that mean for women that have to wait in a hospital for an hour to be seen? What does it mean to who's included in the birthing experience? And now with a wave of birthing suites and all of those different pieces, which were still out of reach for Indigenous women because IHS was the place that we gave birth almost 99% of the time until the OBGYN wing was closed at Santa Fe Indian Hospital. And now women had the choice to choose where they birth, whether St. Vincent's, our local PMS provider, or other places. And so, again, talking about access and what does that mean. But our Yikebin Doula project was about how do we get into a medical system and really honor and advocate the voice of women and what they'd like to experience in their birth. Before we developed our project, we did a research study. We conducted surveys of Tewa women who gave birth. We asked questions about their birthing experience. We asked questions about what cultural knowledge did they have. And so with the help of UNM Indian Health Center, I'm trying to remember the name, sorry, we were able to conduct this study. Bonnie helped us, Julie Lucero helped us, and so this really helped inform the development of our program. And so now we have trained close to 30 doulas from the community. We just trained a core of 10 more, and so we're really pulling forward that piece. Part of the policy work on that is advocating for baby-friendly hospitals, but also educating our community and really striving for policy change. And then so from our doula program, we were talking about, so we're seeing families, we're looking at young kids. What do we have for our teens, our middle school kids, and our elementary kids? Well, we know that there was a lot of elementary education going on child sexual abuse prevention, sexual violence prevention, not a whole lot for our middle school and high school. And so we developed our Unlocking Healthy Sexuality Body Sovereignty project, looking at a year-long needs assessment, developing criteria, and then choosing the curricula that we did. And this was a teen pregnancy prevention grant from FIBSI. But as mentioned earlier, we didn't see this as a teen pregnancy prevention grant. We really wanted it to be about empowering our young people to make healthy choices about their body, about when they became sexually active, about knowing all the consequences of what that meant around STDs, knowing what it meant around contraceptives and what was available and what was accessible to them. And for us, again, it was about ending the violence against women and girls and increasing the positive communication that should be occurring between any individual
Well, they did surveys among their peers, and the top 3 things that came out that they found, they did surveys among other young women of color, and in their peer surveys, they found that the 3 reasons why young people, they wanted to address dropout rates. The 3 reasons why their peers identified, the top 3 reasons, were sexual harassment, teen pregnancy, and substance use. This was a peer survey. They got like almost 200 young people, young women of color, to answer this. When they did so then through our organizing model, we do this process, finding out what's the landscape, what's winnable, what's not, where can we move things. So they learned that at that time, this was in 2003 or so, that abstinence-only programs were the law of the land in New Mexico. So they started a campaign to get comprehensive sex education for all schools. So the current written policies around, eventually I just want to acknowledge that the success of that was that eventually, after many years of organizing, we're able to, the current public education department standards were developed by Young Women United and their peers with the help of, like, Dr. Luis was one of the folks. There was other Department of Health advocates that worked with community, developed those policies together. So that was a success, right? But in those circles throughout those years, we saw every time, and this was, I was a young parent, my coworker was at one time a young parent, obviously not young anymore, but also some of the young women we were working with are young parents. And while we found ourselves in these rooms of advocating for comprehensive, medically accurate sexuality education, we found the people who are our supposed allies, the people who we were working towards the same goals, were the same people that were stigmatizing and shaming our families and communities. So you've all been in the room where everybody talks about how if you're a teen parent, your kid's going to be in jail, addicted to drugs, and never graduate high school. And that was not resonating with the realities of what our families were. And so in these rooms, the people who were in sense doing the most harm to our communities, our families, the ways that our women wanted to be leading this work, were the people who are in allyship with us. And sometimes I always say, is this... what happened first? Where did we get to the place that we believed that shame and stigma was the answer to addressing teen pregnancy? Because really, the whole entire National Teen Pregnancy Prevention Campaign and what comes down and gets filtered through our departments of health across the country is this whole model. If you ever get the chance to look at their mission, literally talks about we want to prevent the pregnancy of young people and people that aren't married. So this whole heteronormative frame that says we have to be married, that says we have to be a certain age, does not fit. And it is the frame in which all of our work comes out and all of the resources get drained into our communities. So, the whole, I think, again, I want to be as short as possible, provide some time, that the idea that shame and stigmatizing young people would prevent teen pregnancy has, one, it hurts me that it ever started, but two, it's been tried through for decades now, and it hasn't worked. I think the things that we can link to teen pregnancy, like the article, the research that Dr. Bullock presented today, is that things like poverty, so it's no mistake that New Mexico is the lowest, it has some of the highest poverty rates, and we have the highest teen pregnancy. Those are the correlations that can be made. There's no mistake that places like in New Mexico, where we have lack of access to post-secondary education, living wage jobs, healthcare, those are the reasons those are the conditions which create the current conditions of why young people are having kids at a young age. So I want two last things. So there's so much. But, so sex ed, housing, so the piece around, so we've led policies based on the education goals. So it's been a practice also for generations to push out young parents from the school system. Again, a way to shame and stigmatize young people, remove them from the situation so it's not catching. Pregnancy isn't catching. And there's actually been research to show, so this whole also, which is very painful, and I would say a lot of the language that's used by teen pregnancy prevention, and hopefully if it's used by you, that there's a little bit of increased awareness today, that there's the whole model of how teen pregnancy bears this burden of cost to our community. So I'm sure you've seen that it costs $1.2 billion to teen pregnancy costs to New Mexicans, to the United States. There's been research done that studied siblings over a period of time, one sibling being pregnant, the other one not, and showed that their economic trajectory in life was not significantly impacted by pregnancy. That basically where you start is how far your economic trajectory is going to get you. And of course, there's all of our stars that rise to the top, but that research among siblings shows that there is not a huge difference. So placing, again, some of the comments around placing burden, trying to place blame, stigmatizing, all of those are actually violent acts on young people that are in sense trying to have a survival mechanism. Our communities that have, Dr. Corinne Sanchez has also explained like how cultural survival, literal survival of our families, of our communities, of our people is tied up in this piece. And so when we only take an approach to addressing teen pregnancy through educating young people about their options, we're not actually taking into context all the things that impact their lives that got them there in the first place. Lastly, I will say that I work with Strong Families. We're a network and we're a national organization as well. I get to do local based work here, but I work with a groups of organizations across the country that are addressing the shame and stigma around young parents, and they're also creating policies that shift the outcomes for young parents, mostly in school systems as of right now. Using Title IX, most folks think of Title IX as only for women in sport, young girls in sports. It actually protects young women and that are pregnant in the school system. That cohort is working to shift this shame and stigma and shift policies that support and don't stigmatize and isolate young people. So any woman that is pregnant for the first time needs resources, support. You could be pregnant at 38 and you still need a whole set of resources, support, whatever. And what we're saying is that any woman, regardless of age, needs those supports. And what we're doing through using a pregnancy prevention model that stigmatizes and shames is we're actually isolating those young people from those resources and support. I could say a lot more, but I'm excited to hear if there's time for a couple questions. That would be great.
Well, as I forewarned, we had much to cover today, and it looks like we're out of time, actually.
If there's any questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat box, and we can stay on and address them, but I know many of you will have to leave. And just so that for those of you who are in the Adolescent Health Initiative Certificate Program and would like to join back in January, we will start back on Wednesday, January 6th, and we will be discussing contraceptive counseling. And so that will be our next session. So we'll be on break for the next couple of weeks, and we'll see you back January 6th. And if there's any questions either from the room or from those joining remotely, please do chime in.
So I want to take a moment to thank again both Adrienne Barboa and Dr. Corinne Sanchez, who agreed to use some of their very stretched time for the work that's done in the trenches to be available today. Thank you again so very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock, as well, for your
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bullock, for including us in the conversation. And I just want to say that many of the groups also organizing are involved in some of the ways that like school-based health center policies at the legislative session are happening. So we appreciate folks reaching out to work with us in developing those policies so that they actually fit the needs. I'm not sure how much people in this room do that, but we're open to conversations.
Totally appreciate all the work that you do. And if there's any questions, anything that you want to touch base with us on, Dr. Bullock has our email information.
And you can also reach out to any of us here at Envision through the Adolescent Health Initiative. We'll be happy to put you in contact with our presenters today. So it looks like we don't have any questions, but many positive comments coming through. So thank you to the 3 presenters today, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Excellent. Excellent.
Oh my God.